here we go again. It could easily happen. And we know the arc of this pandemic as variants after variants after variants by now, that you should not bank on just, oh, we'll be all better on the other side and it'll be over. The hope is good. I'm a very positive person, but I think also false hope, this hopium addiction is really also dangerous, especially if you're selling it again and again to people and you don't give them the reality that
low level, almost gone. Are we almost there, Deepti, or not?
No, certainly not. And the other thing I want to say is there's no pressure on this virus to evolve to become milder. That might happen by chance, but the pressure is on transmission, which happens quite early during spread. So it happens well before people die. So people dying is not disadvantageous for this virus. When you just think of it in terms of natural selection and what is selected, traits like transmissibility, which happen early on, and escape, those are the two things that will be selected. Severity is not something that's under selection, so it could go either way.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. Are you a bit confused, like I am, about where we're going with COVID? I mean, one minute you hear the pandemic could be ending, and the mutations like Omicron are leading to a milder virus. Then another study says Omicron can cause brain dysfunction, long-lasting COVID symptoms, more illnesses in children, more hospitals of kids, but with less fatal outcomes. Do the vaccines work? A new study out of Israel says 4 shots, that's 2 vaccines and 2 boosters, don't protect against getting Omicron, but maybe prevent more serious illness. And now in Britain, they're announcing this week mask mandates are gone, from a prime minister who's led the country to have one of the worst health records in Europe on COVID. And the Omicron variant peak may have passed in many US states. Here's the truth. Masks can prevent you from getting sick. Sitting outside instead of in is the best choice. This pandemic is not over. A new variant is likely just around the corner. It could be worse. COVID will be with us for many years. Sorry, but that's the real deal. To discuss all this, 2 epidemiologists I've come to know over the last couple of years who I trust. Joining me now is Deepti Gurdasani, a well-known epidemiologist from Cambridge, and Eric Feigl-Ding, who I've had the pleasure of speaking to from Washington. And I've been able to talk to both of you incredibly throughout the pandemic, and you are my go-to people for understanding what's going on and being able to cut through some of the fog. And it's pretty thick right now when you're trying to honestly understand where we are in the pandemic. So I'm hoping that you'll both help me do that. First of all, say hello to one another. I know you know each other.
Hi, Eric.
Hey, everyone. Hey, Dana. Hey, Deepti.
What do epidemiologists say to one another when they meet each other in the bar? No, I better not use a bar analogy, but what do epidemiologists say to, like journalists, we get together and we're like, this, have you seen what's going on with the number 10 Downing Street and what's really behind the scenes? What do epidemiologists in the middle of this pandemic say to one another when you kind of, meld minds a little bit and talk about where we are?
You just sadly nod and acknowledge how terrible your life is right now and how it's likely to remain so for the next many, many years. Yeah.
Eric?
It's like you walk by someone who understands you, you do that nod, it's like, yeah. But I think it's also, I would want to say that there are many, epidemiologists and experts, and, many people claim to be experts during the pandemic, right? And in many ways, many people have diverse opinions, and sometimes there's camps that evolve. There's the precautionary principle camp who try to look at the early signals and, try not to be when WHO says there's no evidence of human-human transmission. Oh, there's no evidence of asymptomatic transmission. Oh, you don't need to wear a mask unless you have symptoms. Oh, it's not airborne. Oh, there's no reinfection. Oh, the list goes on.
That's
that's
an incredible real list, right?
Yeah, that's a real list of things that happened in early 2020, and the airborne thing, the denialists, it kept going into 2021 as well. And I think in certain ways, Deepti and I are in the same agreement on most everything about the precautionary principle and a lot of the emerging worrisome data. While remember when every wave it happens, and Deepti, tell me what you think. There's the first few weeks when cases are just inching up. And the naysayers is, it's uncoupled. There's no hospitalization. And then hospitalizations start climbing. But it's climbing so slow. There's no deaths. And then deaths climb. I was like, the deaths are still so low. And then of course, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it does bend, and it bends very quickly in a pandemic, unfortunately. And I think in certain ways, the precautionary scientists are trying to warn ahead of time. And the dismissive downplaying scientists oftentimes, we don't know too much. Don't worry, don't act yet. Nothing to get concerned about. Move along, nothing to write home about. And of course, this is why we're also in pandemic wave 4 right now.
Deepti, do you want to take a run at that? I mean, Eric seems to be saying there that, while people are living in self-denial, especially the authorities and governments, that people like yourselves kind of were able to see what was coming, and often told us, I think, through social media what was around the corner.
Yes, I mean, I think you get absolutely zero credit for having predicted things properly. In fact, the people I see platform the most are the ones who've given flawed positive messaging at the cost potentially of people being able to protect themselves with accurate information. I mean, I find myself absolutely flummoxed at this particular time when we've seen possibly the fastest spreading virus, I think in decades, if not in centuries. And the rate of growth, we've never seen before. And at the same time, what I hear in the media all the time is, this is the end of the pandemic. This is becoming endemic, completely opposite to what we're actually observing in reality. So there's the reality, which is completely observable around us, and the rhetoric that you hear in the media, platforming prominent scientists who keep saying this, who keep comparing COVID to flu, when the reality around us tells us that that's absolutely wrong. And I've never lived through a time like this. I know that climate scientists, people who worked on, tobacco related science have dealt with this before. And I think we need to learn from them. But there's a huge disconnect between what we're hearing and what's real.
Huge disconnect. So you don't feel that we're rounding a corner. You don't feel that Omicron is any less deadly, if I can use that term, than Delta or the other variants. And you feel that the media keeps playing up the idea that, people are getting it, but, it's much milder.
So first, I want to say, I do think that Omicron has lower severity than Delta intrinsically. But I don't think that's a major reason for why the realized severity is low at population level. The truth is, Omicron is breaking through that wall of immunity in a way Delta wasn't. So it's infecting people who have been vaccinated, people who've had previous infection, even people who are boosted. So these people who would not have gotten infected with Delta are now getting infected. And yes, once they get infected, their risk of hospitalization is lower because they have been vaccinated, they have been boosted, they have had prior immunity, and there is a level of reduced intrinsic severity as well of Omicron. But I don't think that the overall impact at population level is reduced, because let's remember, these people wouldn't have been infected by Delta. So we have more people getting infected. We have very, very high transmission rates in this pandemic. We have levels of cases that have never been seen before globally in many, many, many countries. And that, in my view, will still put significant pressure on hospitals and is still causing many deaths. And we cannot ignore that. In the UK, people don't talk about this very much. we have levels of people in hospital that are quite similar, just slightly lower than our first wave. And when we went to our first wave, they acted late. They didn't know what was going on. We didn't have vaccines. So are we really happy with the situation where we've had 2 years of this? We know about airborne spread. We know what precautions work. We have vaccines. We have treatments. We have boosters. But instead of reducing the number of deaths and hospitalizations and the pressures on health services and long COVID, we've chosen to just tolerate higher levels of cases so that we can get there with much higher levels of cases despite all the advancements. I mean, to me, that's unacceptable.
Eric, is that your read? I mean, that it's not.
Yeah.
I mean, Deepti said it is getting milder, but
yeah. First of all, a milder is it's a relative thing. I think everyone agrees in the evidence that Delta is at least twice as, not just twice as contagious, but also twice as severe, if not some data say 3 times more severe than the Wuhan 1.0 virus. So, and all our comparison is, it's milder than Delta. But Delta was already so much more severe than the original variant, right? The original virus. And, I've heard so many times, and Deepti knows what I'm talking about, we're herd immunity. This is like probably the 5th or 6th wave I've heard, we're herd immunity. And this is the end of the pandemic because we are herd immunity. And I think the herd immunity, theoretically works. The other problem, of course, is it assumes perfect admixture of vaccinated and unvaccinated people, which is not true. And also the waning immunity issue. Whether past infection protects you. There's actually a study that just came out yesterday that, Omicron infection does not protect you that much from another Omicron that fully.
Oh, really? Where was that, by the way?
It's a preprint that's just coming out, but it was published by a prominent lab. But this is like really worrisome. See, we follow this emerging data, but a lot of people don't. And there's also T cell damage, T cell destruction that's warned by a lot of immunologists that this really hurts your immune response long term. And of course, it's not just deaths or hospitalizations, it's also long COVID, which Finland, which is the least political of all, their health policy and health departments are very, very apolitical. They really warn that 1 in 2 people could have long COVID. I think the evidence is that this is serious, is long-term, and the surge of the cases, even if it's intrinsically slightly milder, and I agree it's slightly milder, it's fine, but the issue is, even if you're 50% milder, which is not 50% milder, but the virus doubles in 2-3 days, in some places a day and a half early on, literally any benefit of a 1/2ing is swamped out by a doubling in 2 days. Right?
Deepti tweeted today, not to mention that long COVID in kids has already tripled pre-Omicron. Why aren't we vaccinating children with benefits to them and younger siblings? Why are we mitigating infections in schools? Why isn't this a much bigger scandal and reported in the media? Do you both agree that children seem to be more vulnerable and that more of them are winding up in hospital?
Yeah.
So the evidence from the UK, certainly we're seeing many more hospitalizations with COVID. How many of those have COVID as a primary cause is unclear, but the top 3 complaints of children going to hospital are consistent with respiratory illness. And the analysis done by our scientific advisory body shows that the severity of Omicron is not lower than Delta in terms of hospitalizations in under 10s. And that, again, sort of reinforces...
But less of them are going into, as you pointed out in your own tweet, I'm not being smart here, but more children aren't requiring ICU, intensive care. Exactly.
So that analysis was done, I think, with respect to hospitalization, but the children who are being admitted don't seem to be requiring ICU. They don't seem to be requiring oxygen. So they are what have been branded as mild hospitalizations, I guess. But, 800 hospitalizations in a week is not normal. And it's not something that we should accept when even those hospitalizations could be prevented. And it's not just hospitalizations. I mean, like I said, long COVID had increased massively in the UK. So we had 117,000 children compared to about 5 months before, which was about 34,000. That's a huge increase. And of those, 20,000 children have had illness for more than a year. So a lot of people think, oh, it's a post-viral illness, but having persistent symptoms for more than a year in 20,000 kids. And COVID is a more deadly disease than almost every other childhood illness, both in the UK and the US. So these comparisons that are often done with adults, I find quite disingenuous, because do we need tens of thousands of children or hundreds of thousands of children to die for us to realize that this is a serious problem? Because if you compare with other illnesses in children, it's far more serious, both in acute illness as well as in long-term illness. So I don't know if the level of hospitalizations is because we're having huge numbers of cases, because in the UK, we don't have vaccines for under 12s, and we don't have any robust mitigation policy in schools, or whether it is the fact that, this is not less severe than Delta in children. I don't know what the answer to that is, but what I can say is that whatever it is, I'm sure it's preventable, and we're not doing enough.
Eric, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, I agree completely with the Deepti. I think also, like earlier in the Omicron wave, which feels like eons ago, I think South Africa even published that it's 20% more severe than Wuhan for children, Omicron, among kids. I think that's pretty worrisome. South Africa, of course, some people try to downplay, oh, look, South Africa, no deaths. By the way, deaths are increasing. South Africa is running a 30% excess mortality over their 2015 to 2019 average baseline. And so 3,000 deaths a week, basically, 30% excess. And it seems to be holding. It's emerging like over a month after their wave peaked, right? But it's somehow, this is the slow, and Omicron is not like the fast moving, but it's in terms of severity, but it's clearly slow and steady, and the excess deaths show it. And again, children is the real concern, because, I always hate it. I really hate it when people say, well, look, kids are, their mortality unvaccinated is lower than a vaccinated elderly person. It's like, look, kids are low risk. But, the thing is, like, an elderly, there is a high natural background rate of death in the elderly. And vaccines obviously reduce that against COVID. But kids shouldn't die. The number of kids that should die is zero, right? In our society, there should be zero kids that die, zero kids that get hospitalized, zero kids that get long COVID, because like lead poisoning, we always think of lead poisoning oftentimes because lead poisoning, the brain damage is very long term. And if the neurological damage of COVID on the brain is real, that damage could be lasting as well.
Could I jump in and get both of you to react to this Israeli study now that came out in the Sheba Medical Center, which is a very limited study, they say, admittedly, but that the fourth dose of Pfizer increases the level of antibodies, but they are saying it does not seem to offer protection against infection by the coronavirus Omicron variant. I mean, that's
versus 3 shots.
Versus 3, yeah. But in general, 4, even with 2 vaccines and 2 boosters, it doesn't seem to give you protection against infection. It may mitigate severe illness.
I mean, that's why I think we really need a vaccine plus approach. I mean, there's only so much boosting that you can do against, I guess, even previous variants. I mean, these are not vaccines that were designed for the current variant. Even if they were, I doubt they would have a long last.
Sorry, you cut out a little bit there. They weren't designed for?
I mean, they were not designed for the current variant. They were designed for the original variant. But I suspect even if they had been designed for the current variant, they wouldn't provide lifelong or long-term immunity. So, we need a vaccine plus approach, and approaches that are variant resistant as well. So things like all variants are transmitted through airborne transmission. The hugely overlooked measures in this pandemic, in the Western world particularly, I think, are things like high-grade mask ventilation that not just reduce SARS-CoV-2, whatever variant, but also many, many other viruses. I mean, there are studies within the BMJ that show flu, measles, meningitis showed massive reductions in children, when mitigations were applied. So we can't just rely on vaccines. And I think there's ample proof of that at least the current generation of vaccines. Yes, in the future, there might be a sterilizing vaccine with long-term immunity that emerges. But for now, what we need is a vaccine plus approach. And we need to suppress transmission so that the variant's not always ahead of us, unless we slow down evolution and have protective measures, including for all vulnerable people and immunocompromised people. I suspect that we will be chasing the virus with a vaccine-only strategy, which has, to me, been one of the biggest failures of pandemic policy across Western Europe.
Where does that take
it's the most convenient. The vaccine-only strategy is chased because it's the most convenient to date, right? Other than the let it rip, which
open businesses and open travel.
Yes.
Try to get back to normal.
Yeah. I know, like, vaccines are really good against hospitalizations, and boosters, I've seen the data, are really good, but they seem to wane clearly. With even 3 shots, they wane from 70% to less than 45% in 10 weeks. In the latest hospitalization seems to also now, with a booster, instead of 90, 95%, it's around 80s in terms of protection against hospitalization. It's good, but it's not foolproof, right? And again, especially for transmission, oftentimes there's a disconnect. There are those who say, well, hospitalizations aren't surging. They are. Deaths aren't surging that much. They are, especially among kids. We're record pediatric hospitalizations and deaths as well. But the transmission is the bigger thing for me. Like all the Paxlovid and all these drugs, they work, but there's a huge shortage, if you haven't heard. Monoclonal antibodies, 2 out of the 3 major ones don't even work. The one that remaining, still a huge shortage. These are stopgap. Like, these drugs are only stopgap because they don't slow transmission. What I care about, and clearly Omicron taught us, is transmission is what ultimately kills more. And I have a lot of friends who, hey, I'm boosted. I wear masks. I have a stack of tests in my closet. Yeah, you're able to afford it. Here in America, it's very expensive and hard to find. And I have HEPA filters. I'm fine. Why can't I socialize with my friends? And theoretically, yes. But my question is always, what about your family members or other extended loved ones or people around you? Do they have all the tests that you have, HEPA filters and N95 masks that you have, and have the knowledge to get boosted like you have? Not all of them. And of course, many are immunocompromised, of course. And I think that's the thing. Like, yes, theoretically, some people could be very safe. If I'm boosted and have all these other protections, I really don't think I'm going to go to a hospital. But around us, a lot of people are not in this perfect bubble of perfect mitigations, right? And if you keep letting your guard down and transmitting it, you're not endangering yourself necessarily, you're endangering them. And this selfish attitude, we don't even need to talk about, Boris Johnson going to that party in the lockdown. But even now, people are...
No, never mind. Let's not get into them.
The naughty Santa apology. No, we really need to focus on stopping transmission. And the government just has not gotten around to it. They basically mitigate hospitalizations is their main goal, right? But transmission does not seem to be their goal, and long COVID be damned.
All right. Deepti, I tend to disagree with some of your tweets about the media, because I think the media actually does cover it as best they can. It may be that governments and people who have a vested interest in trying to get things back to normal are a little better at getting their messages out. And sometimes we are led by that. And I can't speak for all media.
That's not the UK media. The BBC has been putting out misinformation, normalizing government rhetoric for a really, really long time. I mean, they are putting out blatant misinformation. There's absolutely no doubt that it's deliberate. And they've been threatened by the government many, many times, and their independence has been severely compromised over the years since.
To not cover the potential severity of a variant?
The articles that are put out always platform people who are anti-mask in children, anti-vaccine children, and minimize the impact of COVID and essentially say it's become endemic or it's near the end of the pandemic without any opposing views.
Well, it may be wishful it may be wishful thinking, right, by a lot of people. And so there you have Dr. Fauci being interviewed yesterday, and he says that we're really in the first phase of the pandemic. The next phases are deceleration, control, elimination, eradication. In other words, endemic, that it's no longer a disruptive presence and it begins to run itself out. Do you, either one of you, think we're heading in that direction, or there could be another variant down the road that gives us a completely 180-degree turn?
So I don't understand that argument at all, because we're facing mass disruption. I mean, in the UK, 1 in 10 healthcare workers are off sick. So many teachers are off sick. Pupils, we've had 300,000 pupils off sick in the second week of school. I mean, I don't know what mass disruption society looks like. Our health services are overwhelmed. We have the military coming in to help NHS staff. 30 trusts, which is, I think, more than 1 in 6 have issued emergency alerts. People with heart attacks are being told that they can't get ambulances to come in. I don't know what mass disruption would look like. I mean, I can't speak to the US, but I've seen several reports about hospitals, even pediatric hospitals, being overwhelmed in New York City. So I really want to understand what he thinks disruption looks like, because to me, this doesn't look good from any angle, whether it's the economy, society, or from a public health angle.
Eric, let me ask you the same question. Deepti didn't exactly commit to it, and I'll give her another chance to do it if she wants to. But do you think that the road is running out, that we are heading towards an endemic situation where the next variant will be less?
So I see a fork in the road.
Or there's no evidence of that?
I think there's a fork in the road. And I'm not sure what is the exact outcome. There are some who say we're never going to have another variant that is faster transmitting than Omicron. That's some. I'm not saying I agree. I don't know if that's actually true, but it could be true. And then if that's the case, then you're not going to find, it's kind of like Omicron displaced Delta. We're not going to find something that is fast enough to displace Omicron. But and therefore, they say, therefore it'll go endemic, everyone will have immunity, blah, 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 this will be the end. I don't think that's necessarily going to be, I think that could be 10, 15% chance it happens. But I think the thing is, like, the thing that makes Omicron faster spreading is not just its natural transmissibility, but also its breakthroughs of not just vaccines, but also reinfection breakthroughs. And we easily can have another one of that. And, Omicron, by the way, showed up on the scene in terms of, we found a cluster in early November. By late November, day after Thanksgiving here, it was basically rocking the world. It took literally just 3 weeks. Yeah. And also there's waning natural immunity. So for those who say, oh, we've gotten COVID, Omicron will infect us all, and we'll all come out on the better side, all the long COVID, sick people in between be damned. But assuming that we're all infected on the other side, but you know what? UK did a antibody survey last spring, I think. Deepti can correct me. They found 90% of people had antibodies, and this is before everyone got vaccinated. And so theoretically, by summer, everyone should have been immune. But clearly, Delta and Omicron is rocking the UK and rocking many other countries again, even though they had high past immunity. And this is my point. There's waning immunity against past infection. In the latest studies I mentioned, Omicron doesn't actually yield that much additional protection against Omicron, unlike Delta did against another Delta. The worrisome is that in a couple months, unclear was it 4, 5, 6 months or more, basically we've waned our immune system enough that we're susceptible to either Omicron again, or there's a new variant that is evasive. And by evasive, it doesn't have to have some sort of evasive technology. It's so different from Omicron that our body doesn't recognize it. And here we go again. It could easily happen. And we know the arc of this pandemic as variants after variants after variants by now, that you should not bank on just, oh, we'll be all better on the other side and it'll be over. And I've heard so many people who said we're herd immunity so many times, and they've been wrong so many times, to the dangerous endangerment of others. And I think that, there's the hope is good. I'm a very positive person, but I think also false hope, this hopium addiction is really also dangerous, especially if you're selling it again and again to people, and you don't give them the reality that you have to have vaccine plus and keep these other mitigations, especially masking and ventilation, until this is suppressed. And I think those false hope people are really in danger.
Deepti, last word to you on this. I mean, Eric talks about a fork in the road.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to say there's a huge misunderstanding of what endemicity means. It doesn't mean what most people think it does. It means a constant, usual, predictable prevalence of a given pathogen in the population. From an epidemiological perspective, it means R being equal to 1. And
it doesn't mean that it becomes COVID light. It could still be quite difficult, but it stops evolving. Is that what you mean?
No, it means that the presence of the population is constant. It doesn't go through these massive surges and dips. That's what, from a strict epidemiological perspective, is. And many pathogens never got there. So measles, if you look at the early trends of measles, even pre-vaccination, smallpox, even influenza has a seasonal trend with outbreaks now and then, but many diseases never achieve endemicity. So if you're talking about strictly endemic, I don't know if this will ever be endemic because it requires persistent immunity in the population.
And we don't want high endemic, at most sporadic. I think elimination, the biosecurity firm the other day said, basically we want to avoid the surges at the high levels and these up and down waves. Sporadic and still consistent with elimination, because you've eliminated from regional areas. And again, that's how we, by the way, defeated smallpox. And I really worry if smallpox was still a global outbreak in 2020 to 2022, if we would actually have the willpower to eliminate it. But because it's basically isolating them to small sporadic pockets and then muzzling it out. But I think getting it to a sporadic, low-level approach of almost gone is our elimination approach. That is still consistent with elimination. We just don't want the high levels. We want to go with as low as 0 as possible. And 0 is still consistent with this sporadic process.
Low level, almost gone. Are we almost there, Deepti, or not?
No, certainly not. And the other thing I want to say is there's no pressure on this virus to evolve to become milder. That might happen by chance, but the pressure is on transmission, which happens quite early during spread. So it happens well before people die. So people dying is not disadvantageous for this virus. When you just think of it in terms of natural selection and what is selected, traits like transmissibility, which happen early on, and escape, those are the two things that will be selected. Severity is not something that's under selection, so it could go either way. And it's not something we can bank on, because I hear many people saying it's moving in the direction of becoming milder. Something that Omicron tells us is that it has a huge space of adaptation, and it can adapt in different directions, surely towards more escape. But in terms of severity, it could go in many different ways. And I don't think that we can bank on that. So I think what we need politicians and scientists to do is actually be honest that this is probably going to be with us longer term. And we need to take action. So this virus, we can't wish it away. We have to adapt to it. And that means long-term changes in the ventilation in buildings in countries that need it and haven't done so yet, supplemental ventilation in the interim to tide us over that period, high-grade masks to deal with highly transmissible airborne transmission. These are hugely overlooked things that will help, not just with SARS-CoV-2, it helps with so many different things. In fact, ventilation in schools helps with cognition of children as well, and attention span. So all of these are good things that we should embrace rather than considering them restrictive, and move towards adapting to where we are now rather than denying the situation we're in.
And if the media message continues to be maybe we're on our way out of this, that's not going to happen. People will elude themselves into thinking that we're at the end of the road here, when we may be just at the beginning of it. Exactly.
Yeah. I think, even if it magically does disappear, I think we need a long-term plan. You cannot bank on that happening. I think that's a huge disservice to people, and we need to be honest.
All right. Well, I highly recommend anybody on social media listening to Deepti Gurdasani, because she pulls no punches. And Eric Feigl-Ding has always got great posts about what's going on around the world. Eric, I was even watching your stuff on China today, and how they're taking they're asking pet shops now to give up all of the pets that they were selling, right? It's essentially hamsters, isn't it?
Yeah, it's 2,000 hamsters. Yeah, they're calling them.
China. Yeah.
They're getting very aggressive because the Olympics is coming up and they're having some outbreaks again.
The Olympics, which nobody will be allowed to attend, not from outside the country and not inside the country. It will be the spectatorless Olympics to a large degree. Anyway, you guys are the Olympians of epidemiology, and I thank you both for joining me. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dana. Take care.
So we're all tired and we all want it to go away. I mean, I sure am. But think about your long-term health and those around you. A mask in a crowded area is a very good idea. Vaccines give a lot of protection, as do the boosters. Fresh air, social distancing, all the same precautions we know all too well are worth sticking to. Don't ditch common sense and stay healthy. By the way, my newsletter is free. It comes out a few times a week. danalewis.substack.com. Check it out. And please share this podcast. Thanks for listening to Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis, and I'll talk to you again soon.